Okay, hello everyone and welcome to the Museum of Everyone. Today we are delighted to be joined by Basil Al-Rawi, a visual artist and archivist, and also by Rand Abdul Jabbar, also a visual artist who works in multiple mediums actually. Thank you both for joining us. It's wonderful to have you here. We're going to start off with a couple of presentations. Baz is going to go first. I'll just give you a little bit of information about Baz and his practice ahead of his presentation. And then afterwards, I'll do the same with regards to Ran. And she will also give us a 10-minute presentation. And we'll look forward to a chat then about both of their practices. So Basil Al-Rawi is a visual artist working with photography, moving image, and simulation, creating works concerned with the landscape of memory, identity, politics, and socio-economic traumas. Construction, staging, and intervention are central to his process. Photographs are staged, images subtly altered, and virtual environments are created. Baz has exhibited at IMA, Rua Red, the RHA, the Photographers Gallery, and the Institute of International Visual Arts, amongst others. He received a scholarship from the Glasgow School of Art, an SGSAH, to pursue a PhD research at the School of Simulation and Visualization. His practice-based project is concerned with utilizing archive photographs, audio-visual oral histories, and virtual reality to explore the reconstruction of vernacular photographic moments and associated memories from Iraqi diaspora.
So I'm going to talk briefly here now about specifically about the project that I've been doing as part of my PhD research at the Glasgow School of Art at SimVis. As you said, this project is concerned with recomposing archival material and remediating memories within virtual reality. So I'll kind of take you through some of the background to this project and what's been happening in it. This is a practice-based PhD, and I'll take you through all of that and where it is now. And then I guess we can discuss it a little bit more afterwards. This project really kind of begins with and I kind of located with this old archival photograph of my father. And this is him in Donegal in Ireland in the late 1960s. He was an avid photographer of the landscape specifically. He was a geologist. And I came across this photograph looking through his old photo albums that he kept in his study. And there was a lot of these kind of photographs of his time in Ireland and his time traveling, but there was a lot of photographs of him as a young man growing up in Iraq in his hometown of Rawa, and also going to university in Baghdad. And it was through looking at these photographs that I became interested in, obviously, his life as a young man, a life I hadn't known. I knew him through a different context, but these photographs were showing a perspective on Iraq that was very different from what I was seeing at the time, growing up in Ireland. Growing up in a Western context, and Western media was very dominated by stories and images of conflict. And that continued on, obviously, over the last, I guess you could say it's 4 decades now, really, of that. And what was interesting about these images was that they were showing kind of everyday life, universal stories of life, young people having fun. There were field trips, sports days at college, family occasions, and there was a whole range of things in these albums. And he was through these photographs, they started a conversation. He would tell me about his time growing up in Iraq. And this played a very important role in helping me to understand a part of my identity and a part of my culture and my heritage. And I was very curious to explore this visual landscape more, beyond the kind of images that I was being exposed to through the media, which I suppose we know, which are those images of the Gulf Wars, of Saddam, of Daesh in the more contemporary context. And so in the process of searching through archives for photographs of Iraq, I found there's numerous online collections and numerous books as well too, many of which are kind of showing Iraq at a moment in time, early 20th century, pre-modernity, pre-oil industry, many traditional ways of life depicted. And of course, a lot of these images are taken with a colonial lens. And they have their own political baggage as a result of that. But they do represent, you could say, an important visual ethnographic record nonetheless. But I was quite interested in these kind of images, and also some of the architectural images as well too. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And so we go, this is the kind of imagery that, the visual impression of Iraq is scarred with. And these are the kind of images that have been imprinted, I think, on a lot of people's minds, and for good reason. But I became interested in trying to explore a more vernacular photographic representation of Iraq, which isn't dominated by narratives surrounding conflict, and that aren't coming with the baggage of the colonial lens. And that's where the idea of creating the Iraq Photo Archive came about. And so this is very much a participatory project. And what I did was to create a platform, because I had my dad's photo albums to look through. And then I had, various kind of Pinterest boards that I was finding, and Facebook groups and other sources online where people were posting photographs from Iraq, but they were missing a certain personal touch. And so what I was interested in doing was creating a platform where, I guess, Iraqis, but to give a context, predominantly Iraqi diaspora, so people who have left Iraq at some point in their lives, in the realization that there was these photo albums on my dad's shelves, I was thinking there must be more of these. And so I put a call out to ask people to contribute to this platform. And this is the result of it. People have been engaging with the platform and have been scanning their images and submitting them. And alongside those images, then they were invited to add a short narrative. And that's been completely open-ended. There's nothing prescriptive from me about the type of information that I want to get or the type of images that I want to get beyond a time frame. So it's mostly been pre-1980, but as you can see here, there's an image here from 89, and I'm not going to be too rigid about that either. And so people have offered up narratives and stories, and this is, I guess, a starting point for a discussion. The photograph is something that is an amazing container of memory. And what happens is when somebody takes out a photograph from their albums, as what happened with my dad, and I ask him a question about it, but sometimes I don't even have to ask him a question about it. He would talk about it, and then this flow of memory would begin. And so the next part of this project was an invitation to people to, if they wanted to take part in an interview and in a conversation with me about their photographs. And so I've interviewed quite a number of people, contributors to the archive, to record their narratives as they want to share them, about the photograph and about the photographic moment in particular, and the memories that surround that moment, the feelings, the things that are not represented within the frame, and the things that photography can't do. So trying to go beyond the two-dimensional visual representation of these memories, because photographs are often talked about like that, that these are memories, but they're maybe just a visual record, and I wanted to get into the memory itself. So I've been in the process of engaging with those contributors and interviewing them and recording them. And the next part of this research project is a house or a home or a place to put these memories and to put all this archival material. So just quickly going back on one of the things you might notice from some of the text on the images here is that people are talking about their parents. And it was the same for my context. And what's been interesting with the process so far is that it's been the second generation really who've been, or even third generation diaspora who've been engaging with the archive, probably because they've got that same sense of longing or desire to connect with a culture that they've been disconnected from. Maybe their parents were exiled, or maybe they, for whatever reason, they have had to leave the country. These pictures and these memories then, are quite significant and quite important for them to make that connection. And one of the ways that's facilitated that engagement has been social media and Instagram in particular, which has been a way to engage with people and bring them towards the archive itself. And so in terms of then going back to talking about a house or home for the archive, concurrently with my interest in archival images and stories, I'm also quite interested in architecture and interested in the architecture in Baghdad and in other cities in Iraq, and specifically quite have a fondness for the Shana Shiel and an interest in the style of architecture, and seeing it going through various archives and going through various images, seeing how this vernacular style of architecture was starting to decay and to be destroyed, and maybe not be conserved for various reasons, due to corruption, due to overdevelopment, due to conflict, due to modernization. And there's various different reasons why they're not being preserved. So I was thinking there's no better place to house memories than in a home. And so I suppose what I'm trying to do here now is to create a house of memory, you could say. So what I'm doing is, and I'll quickly take you through this, is more kind of practical process, but by using a number of different reference books and a lot of different photographic references, I'm reconstructing a traditional house. It's not an accurate reconstruction, it's a creative reconstruction. And what I've been doing is looking through a lot of different plans and gathering up, looking through archives, looking through photographic archives to gather references for spaces that no longer exist. Some of them do, but some of them are since destroyed. And in this process, then it's a way of reconstructing a place that I've never been in before. So there's I'm creating I'm going to skip through that because it's, here you can see a plan that I created for one of the houses, and use these plans then to construct a digital model, and this will be an immersive space. I didn't build it this quickly. This is a time lapse, but through the process of using the references and the visual references, I've been constructing this 3D environment, which will become an immersive space where the viewer or the participant will be able to enter this building and explore on one level this reconstructed Shana Shiel house, but on another level they will be able to explore it almost like an exhibition, and various points around the house will become entry points into the archival images and the stories that are connected with them. And so that's where the research is at the moment. There's a bit of experimentation happening with regard to remediating the archival photo and placing it within a 3D environment, beyond just transposing it from one medium to another. There's quite a bit of things happening where photographs are just placed within a virtual environment, and you're trying to engage with a two-dimensional image in a three-dimensional space. A lot of the research is concerned with how you can remediate this kind of archival material and bring it into a 3D environment and change the way we can interact with archival material. So it's trying to bring the photographs to life and to create an engaging experience for the viewer. So the project's trying to work at a number of different registers. So what I'm showing you here are just some, these are some prototype images of where what the space will look like. They're not textured, they're not finished, but there's some work going on in the background here with the creation of this virtual experience. And that is probably where I should finish up. I think that kind of sums it up, and I guess there's probably things I haven't discussed, but I guess we can go through that when we're chatting about
it. Wow, yeah, amazing. I mean, it's such a multifaceted project, which we definitely will. There's so many things I'd love to ask you with regards to it too. It's so interesting as well because I think there are so many wonderful crossovers between your practice and Rand's practice too. It'll be interesting to kind of touch on some of those things, but there's also a kind of number of differences, I suppose, too. So Rand Abdul Jabbar engages in a multidisciplinary approach to creative output, oscillating across a threshold between design, architecture, and the visual arts. Throughout her process, she often borrows from and reconstructs the ephemera of place, history, and memory, employing design, sculpture, and installation as primary mediums of operation. Current research pursuits examine remnants of historic, cultural, and personal narratives surrounding Iraq. Abdul Jabbar interrogates the fragility of Iraq's tangible heritage, creating and composing forms that draw on the artifacts, architecture, and mythology. Simultaneously, she explores and contests with individual and collective memory to produce fragmentary reconstructions of historic events and past experiences. Her work has recently been exhibited at NYU Abu Dhabi Art Gallery, Jamil Art Center, Rabat Biennale, and the Biennale d'Architecture d'Orleans in 2019. She has contributed texts to the Kuwait Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, Bayan Journal, WTD Magazine, and Warehouse 421. Abdul Jabbar received a Master's of Architecture from Columbia University in 2014.
Yeah, thank you again for the kind of invitation to share the work, and you know, I'm very pleased to be kind of alongside Basil because I think that there is a lot of kind of affinity and dialogue in terms of our work that I hope you'll kind of get to see today. I've titled this talk excavating, reconstructing, because I think that there are two verbs that are kind of quite active in my practice, in the sense that I kind of like search or excavate within histories, kind of stories, and try to give them new form through my work. And I'm going to be kind of focusing on a particular project that I'm developing at the moment, but I just wanted to give a kind of brief context, maybe to help situate the work within my larger practice. You know, as you mentioned, kind of through my bio or description of the work, my central focus in terms of my research has been the kind of history and heritage and kind of historic narratives around Iraq, and that is really kind of dated back to 2016 with this particular project called Excavations, which is where maybe the title of this presentation comes through. That was really interested in kind of exploring the multi-layered histories and particularly the kind of archaeological history related to Iraq, and really kind of trying to kind of give new form and new meaning and a new sense of kind of interpretation of the role of that heritage or our kind of ancient history has to play in a kind of contemporary language of Iraq. And this is a project that I developed in collaboration with another Iraqi Kurdish designer named Hozan Zangana. And what it was really trying to do is kind of set up a conversation across fragments of our history, our reinterpreted history, in order to kind of make sense of it. And it's a thread that's been kind of continuing throughout my practice. This is a more recent project, Earthly Wonders, Celestial Beings, where I kind of continue to explore that. This is a kind of collection, a body of work that is really looking towards kind of artifacts, sculpture, architecture, to kind of make sense of the place through its geography, through the land itself, through archaeology, and what it kind of held in terms of meaning or form. And it was sort of, presented in multiple iterations, but this kind of gives you a sense of how through its various fragments and the conversation that you set up across them, you can kind of try to make sense of a kind of larger history. And beyond the, maybe more, formal historic narratives, I've also been looking towards personal narratives. This is a photo of my grandparents from the 1960s. And I love the kind of intimacy that it captured, this kind of like this shadow that my grandmother's casting on my grandfather's shoulder, and the kind of intimacy it was trying to convey about their relationship. And through exploring this kind of personal family history, I produced a series of works called Reconstructions that were really kind of trying to recreate these moments, recreate these experiences, and bring them back to life within a kind of contemporary context. So this is a kind of ink drawing inspired by that work that transformed into a sculptural installation that kind of, projects this ink drawing onto an actual physical cast of my father's shoulder. And tries to recreate that moment in the present where her shadow falls on his, and the title of the work is Her Shadow Looms. And similarly, kind of exploring scent, in this particular case, the scent of gardenia, which is one that held very special meaning to my mother and her kind of memory or relationship to her father's house, the house that she grew up in, and really kind of trying to recreate that experience of kind of being transported to another place or transported to another time, and really making that kind of connection or longing to home. And in addition to this kind of personal history, also looking at a more collective history. So this is a kind of detailed shot of a kind of larger wall that starts to bring together a collection of archival images from people from the city of Ana, which is actually not far from where Basil's father is from, in Rawa. And this project is a research project that was centered around the kind of minaret from this town that was kind of submerged and relocated and rebuilt in the 1980s, and looking at that kind of loss of landscape, that loss of a way of life, and really trying to kind of capture that history and tell that tale. And you see here, there was kind of a research installation that was focused on this building, the minaret of Ana. And was eventually kind of transformed into a larger sculptural work called And the River Washing Its Feet. And what we've done here is recast molds of this building's carved niches. This is a building that was destroyed by Al-Qaeda and later by ISIS. It's gone through kind of these multiple cycles of destruction and rebirth. And with it juxtaposes this kind of video, this projection of a video that brings together archival footage of a man kind of taking his children by the side of the river right before this town was kind of submerged by the construction of a dam. And it's interesting that Basil chose to show an image from the Iraq photo archive of that, almost that similar moment. It's that woman that was showing Ana as it was being submerged, and you see the kind of palm trees just peeking out from the river. And so kind of in this vein, this kind of vein of kind of trying to explore this connection between a kind of maybe a formal history, but also a personal history and a collective history and how they intersect, I wanted to focus today's kind of conversation around the project that I'm currently developing with the Shabak Festival in London for the summer of 2021, the summer of this year. And it's one that started about a year ago. The title of the work is Every Act of Recognition Alters What Survives. And it's a participatory project that kind of brought a collection of women from the Iraqi and Arab diaspora in London into a workshop called Memories of Home that we launched kind of in the summer of last year. and really invited participants with a very simple prompt to kind of bring along an object that they either inherited or brought with them from their home country. And this can vary, but it's one that it's of sentimental value, that really holds a lot of meaning and memory for them, to really kind of explore our relationship to memory, our relationship to this kind of concept or construct of home through these objects. And this is a kind of, slide that, starts to indicate some of the objects that were selected for this project. And, this was kind of, right at the start of the pandemic, and it started off as you can see here, a kind of online participatory workshop that took place over the course of a few months through these bi-weekly sessions. And in it, we explored various things, it really explored the importance of memory, the place of memory within our lives, especially within diasporic communities. We kind of tried to re-examine the role of these objects within our lives. So a series of kind of drawing exercises, tracing, memory drawing, blind drawing, drawing by feel, and really kind of starting to re-examine or find ways to view these objects in a kind of new lens. We kind of held a series of presentations, including one by Basil Al-Rawi, who was invited to really talk about his engagement with the archive and his engagement with history, and really inviting these participants to also be part of that process of contributing to the Iraq Photo Archive. We explored films and discussed these films. This is one called In Vitro by a Palestinian artist named Larissa Sansour, that is really this conversation between multiple generations, a kind of a young woman and her mother, and really looking at the role of kind of memory and history and nostalgia and the trauma associated with that as well. And from it, we produced a kind of series of what I call recordings. That is this idea of kind of like, how do you counter these mainstream narratives, the way your history is being told, the way media is kind of perpetuating a certain image of the place that you're from, through your own individual narratives, your own recordings, your own kind of platform to capture a history that reflects an experience that is at once personal, deeply personal, but on the other hand is sort of collective in the sense that it kind of mirrors the experience of everyone else. And through these fragments, again, you kind of start to compose a more collective image of the Iraqi or Arab diasporic experience. And these are kind of some examples of that. In September of last year, I actually managed to make it to London for a kind of in-person residency and really kind of meet with these women finally face to face and get to kind of continue to work through some of the ideas that we're exploring through mapping, writing exercises, and think about how we can kind of start to give form to some of these themes that we were exploring, some of the feelings that were come out, some of the outcomes of this workshop and the recordings that they were producing, to conceive of a work that kind of starts to, really kind of formulate an experience that is kind of rooted in London, but also rooted in the present, but captures some of the kind of emotional conditions related to memory and displacement in this kind of diasporic experience. And we set up a kind of website now called activerecognition.com that really becomes a kind of digital space to archive this project, and as it continues to evolve. And that includes a section called Reflections that kind of really reflects on this experience that we had together with this workshop, but also recordings, which is where you can find more information and kind of get a little bit of an insight into how these women chose to kind of record their experiences in their own ways through drawing and photography and writing. And these are kind of some examples of what came out of that. And this is a space that kind of continues to evolve and grow as this project develops towards the summer. And I encourage you to kind of keep an eye on it in the next few months to see how, some of the project updates and developments. Yeah, so this is kind of a little overview of what I've been working on these past few years.
Wow, wonderful. That was so great and really informative. It's also great just to kind of bear witness in some part to the journey you both have gone on to an extent where it starts off with something sometimes completely intangible. But finding, or it's almost like the archaeology of your research and finding an object, be it a photograph or something else, but that being a starting point, and sometimes that being a very personal thing, can also have very kind of universal kind of repercussions. And it's interesting that both of you are kind of ended up in this very kind of collaborative space and developing these platforms, not only to explore your artistic trajectories, but to welcome ideas and other histories that are kind of intrinsically related to both who you are as artists and your heritage. And that, I think that's really fascinating. But I think one thing that's really important, and both of you had touched on it, is the notion of Western media and representation in general. With regards to the work that you're making, it's something that is very much kind of moving kind of against that. And Baz, how important was that for you? Let's say to begin with.
Well, look, it's for me. It was key. This idea that there's a latent counter narrative that's there, and that could be tapped into. And I suppose there's an assumption that it exists when you're just coming from the personal angle, which is the conversation that I had with my dad and with other members of my family, but predominantly with my dad, about the impression that I had of a certain culture, of a people, of my own culture. It's a strange situation to be hearing that culture and that people and that country and everything related to it to be spoken about and to be represented in a very almost kind of one-dimensional way. And then all of these kind of perversions that are happening, where that experience of conflict, of exile, are being exploited for entertainment through video games and through movies, and you're growing up and people are playing these games and they're watching these films and they're talking about them, and they're getting enjoyment out of something that back home, sitting around the kitchen table, those images that were up on the screen are literally, they couldn't be closer, with relatives and family. So that kind of, for me, it was kind of key to this desire to want to create a platform where not only that I can engage, because obviously there's a sense of a personal journey here as well too, with an engagement with identity, but also for an opportunity for Iraqis and Iraqi diaspora in particular, to give them some kind of a platform where they can have agency to be the authors of their own narrative, and that those narratives are no longer being exploited. The history of Iraq is a history of exploitation of people trying to take whatever they can from it, be it land or oil or narrative or story, or so I was like, this is an opportunity for Iraqis to be the authors of their own narratives, and so that's that was the driver for me. That kind of representation through the media was a huge catalyst for this project, and trying to find other modes of representation, and the familial and the everyday and the human are the ones that are probably the most emotive and the ones that people can connect with across cultures. It's about kind of building understanding and building connection, and people can relate to those moments of seeing a graduation, or people at a picnic, or people dancing at a wedding. You know, so that's been the core. I could keep going on with that.
But it's true. It's the notion that the humanity, I suppose, is edited out in Western media when it comes to certainly the representation of Iraq and the Middle East. And with regards to yourself, Rand, as well, I suppose the same question would go to you. Do you think that has shaped you know, your trajectory with regards to this project, because you were working with Diaspora of a number of women there as well?
It's interesting because there, you know, like I had never intended for this to really be a kind of women-only project. It was something that happened by accident, but it was something that I learned a lot from, because I think it really brought the question of legacy kind of center stage, and you see that even in the kind of example of that Larissa Sansour film, that is a kind of, you know, daughter and her mother having a conversation about that, and I think this question of legacy, about like, you know, how do we preserve our stories and how do we pass on our experiences to the future generation, that it really becomes kind of center stage, you know, perhaps with a more kind of female grouping. Because that is kind of intrinsic to how stories and oral narratives are kind of passed on throughout generations. So that really became a kind of important focus of our conversation. And there was, what's interesting about the group is that there was this kind of like, you know, multiple generations that were represented within it. So you had people who, you know, kind of an older generation that actually lived and left Iraq, and then there were also the kind of younger generation. In one case, there was actually a mother and daughter within the larger group, and there are people who either left when they were very young, or people that were actually born abroad in the diaspora. And it created this kind of moment where these two generations were kind of facing each other and having an open discussion around this legacy, and around kind of the history of trauma and how that's passed on across generations, how that's inherited. And on the one hand, you had the older generation talking about how they really, you know, went out of their way to try to protect and really kind of create some sort of, you know, barrier or buffer from this pain, from this trauma that they had experienced, in an effort to try to preserve or protect the next generation. Whereas the younger generation saying like, you know, despite your efforts, you know, you couldn't protect me because I saw it in your experience, I saw it in your eyes, I saw it in the way you behaved. And in fact, I actually feel kind of almost like a double sense of guilt, in the sense that I feel your pain, but I also feel guilty that I haven't been the one to experience that directly. And so, you know, that notion of pain transformed throughout our discussion into this idea of knowledge, that actually pain is knowledge, and knowledge of our history and knowledge of our experience is actually what allows us to kind of move past it, to kind of work through it and find ways to kind of persevere. So yeah, I guess that's a kind of, yeah, my approach.
I think that's fascinating, especially I suppose in even looking at the idea of inherited traumas as well. I also, I suppose, looking at earlier on in your presentation, the sculptural objects, and the idea of us and our propensity as human beings as well to always try and create some creative narrative from the objects. You know, we're always trying to decode the world, you know, and that obviously, well, it's good news for curators and it's good news for artists. And so, I mean, it starts from, you know, whether you walk into somebody's house and you look at the objects in their house, or obviously when you go into a gallery, you know, that's obviously going to be a little more structured. But the idea of creating these objects as well as kind of starting points, and also as these, I suppose, kind of punctuations and representations and echoes of the past to an extent. and to create a landscape for them to exist in. And as you have mentioned, there were a few kind of iterations of how these might have been arranged. Can you talk to me a little bit about the objects themselves and how important is not only the object, but the placement and the space between those objects?
You know, your kind of observation is quite astute in the sense that kind of relating it to this idea of objects in someone's home, because whether it's the kind of sculptural objects or whether it's the kind of approach with the memories of home and asking participants to bring an object to the conversation, it really stemmed from a very personal kind of childhood experience, and I think one that's quite universal. That is kind of growing up in a household where your parents surround you with objects that kind of are meaningful to them in some way. And in my case, growing up also in a diaspora household, it was like these objects that almost became kind of markers or portals to another place that, you know, that they felt was very significant. And so both of those kind of lines of thinking or inquiry within my practice really come from that, you know, experience as a child of looking at objects around you and trying to imagine the place that they represented. For me, there isn't so, like, for me, I'm kind of more interested in that kind of formal dialogue, this idea of reverberation across times, that there are certain forms that emerge and reemerge and kind of have that conversation across scales. There was one particular object as part of the Earthly Wonders series that is this kind of like long black, almost like, it kind of emerged from this image that I found of a kind of Sumerian pin. And I had collaged at some point before doing this project with another image from my personal family archive that shows my father as a young boy on a trip to the marshes. And I had made that formal connection, but kind of maybe forgot about it at some point. And then I brought my father to this exhibition. And the first thing he said was like, oh, this reminds me of the boats from the marshes. And all of a sudden, these kind of two worlds started to collide, that there is a kind of like, yeah, this kind of, this history that is very present in both kind of like an archaeological sense, but also in terms of a kind of personal familial experiences that start to kind of coalesce and collide through the formal expression of objects.
It's also fascinating, and probably because of your research as well, that you're able to, I suppose, translate that from your experiences, and also to be able to trace it so articulately when you're talking about it. Rand has talked about the importance of home and her observations growing up of objects that were important to her parents, and recognizing both their importance and their positioning within the home, and how that how she can trace that into what she's doing today. For you, home is quite important, and you're talking about it in a very different kind of sense, where you're reimagining, or actually, I suppose, imagining an artificial space. Can you tell us a little bit about why, first of all, you think that they need to be housed in this creative kind of three-dimensional space, and the journey that you've gone on? So it's kind of a fascinating space for you to be investigating and for you to be creating. So, but again, it's home, isn't it?
Yeah, it's you know, there's I suppose an interesting journey there, which comes from, I suppose, how I've been working with photography over a number of years, and working with kind of I suppose manipulating maybe archival images to sort of to condense two places in one, almost like a kind of form of collage, you could say, or montage. So, you know, there's Rand showed an image from a presentation during the workshop, which was a series of postcards that I'd made back in 2014, which were images taken in my hometown where I grew up in Leixlip, where I had sought out structures, architectural structures, or different kind of places and spaces within that town that had echoes of the places that I had seen through archival photos from Iraq. And so that's, I suppose, where the seed of all of this kind of began, which was a process of trying to condense these two places. It's sort of a hybrid, psychological place where you're growing up in one place, but a part of you is also living in another place, but a place you've never been to. And so I was in the process of doing that exploration, which was very much a psychogeography type exercise of wandering through familiar places from my hometown, and then trying to view them in a different way, and finding really interesting structures like a spiral barn, which echoes the mosque in Samarra, and these kind of iconic heritage sites in Iraq that I was very familiar with. So whenever I saw that barn, I saw it as, I saw something else. It sort of transported me, the echo of the structure kind of transported me to a place I'd never been. And so the postcards were created, and I used them as a way of connecting with that identity that I was trying to explore, but also they were delivered to my family in Iraq, and we opened up a dialogue there with relatives who I hadn't spoken with very much. And so this idea of, maybe I'm kind of going off topic a little bit, but this is where this idea of home, that project was called Close to Home, because these things kind of felt like I was trying to locate myself. Well, where is home really? It's the physical place you grow up, but then you also have this other space that exists, and how can they coexist? How can how can you make these identities coexist? And so the process of then manipulating photographs, I got quite interested then in the photograph as a reference for, a digital reconstruction. What happens if you can go back into that photograph? Because the archival image is appealing to people. People love looking at old photographs, and there's a whole currency in coloring them in. There's a big thing at the moment. Fad of let's recolorize these pictures and imagine what it would look like to see old World War I photographs, but now they're in living color. And so people are quite excited about this, and I suppose I'm part of that as well too. I'm quite interested in the archival image, but what happens if we can go back to that moment, but expand it? So it's sort of an expanded photographic moment. It's not limited by the two dimensions of the frame, and it's not limited by a temporality. You imagine if you could step inside it in some way, shape, or form, and that's I did a project called Baba Gurgur, Father of Flames, which was an archival photograph of the bitumen fires in northern Iraq near Kirkuk, which is the site of the first oil discovery in Iraq, which I suppose is the birth of modernity in, if you would say, in Iraq. So, and that photograph for me condensed so many different things: geological time, geopolitics, conflict, colonialism, technology. So I was very interested in going back to that particular moment to sort of imagine what it would be like to traverse this space. And so I created a kind of expanded photographic moment as in a simulated space. It's a reconstruction. It's not photorealistic. It hints at it, but it's more like creating a space where you can reflect on an image, beyond just looking at the two-dimensional frame, but actually being maybe immersed in it. And so going from the postcard to this reconstructed archival photo to then the reconstructing these other archival moments and the memories with them. So the photos from the archive together with the narratives that people have shared are going to form an immersive experience for people to enter these the word that Rand used I really love, which is fragments, to re-enter these kind of fragments of time and these vignettes, and to travel through them. And then the question comes about as to how do you enter that experience? What is the entry point? And for me, this the house or the Shana Shiel represents a home or experience that maybe I have never had, but it also feels like an appealing space. That's somewhere that you can enter into and be free to explore. You don't, when it's probably hard to talk about it having not been able to experience it, and the fact that it's not created yet, but the space will be somewhere where you can, through objects, and the objects kind of come back into it again, but you walk into a room in one of these houses and will be transported into a photograph through either through audio or some kind of, it will be a virtual reality experience. Yeah.
Something that always fascinates me now is the tangibility and the physicality of an old photograph, because it's an object. Because so often now, images are not objects necessarily. To go from that realm to this, I think is a really fascinating journey. Rand, for you as well, the archaeology of other works and projects does look very much at kind of a very sometimes sometimes you go back centuries and centuries with regards to your investigations and how you piece together particles of the past to create maybe an installation, or to develop again, I suppose, a creative narrative. And can you tell me a little bit about that and the investigative nature of that? Because to a massive extent, due to the centuries and also, I suppose, more immediately the decades of conflict, there has been a lot lost.
It's interesting because I think it connects to something that Basil said really early on, which is kind of like the media representation or perception of a place. And I think, what I can say to that is that there's this kind of question of scale, right? Like these images that we saw, let's say, of the first Gulf War, that are really at this kind of very macro scale of looking at a place in kind of complete darkness and looking at its kind of bombardment. And I think what Basil and I are sort of doing in a way is sort of really zooming into that micro, that very kind of personal first-hand narrative of the person that submits to the archive and says, this is my father or my parents at this particular trip. It's really kind of trying to kind of switch and zoom at the way that you're kind of looking at a place. So that's a kind of an aspect of it, but I think another aspect of it is really kind of searching for a kind of space or carving out a place for yourself to kind of make that narrative part of your own. And I don't know, I mean, honestly, I'd be curious to see how what you think about this, Basil, or how you feel. But for me, that excavations project, which was really a kind of invitation to represent Iraq, it was just like, come and curate this exhibition about what contemporary Iraqi design might look like. For me, was daunting because I couldn't lay claim to that contemporary experience. It's not one that I knew. And it was almost like through history, I found a place for myself. It was like, I might not know what the current condition is like or really speak for the contemporary condition as my own, but this is part of my DNA. This is part of my ancestry. This is a part of the story that I could really lay claim to. And start to kind of work with and manipulate. And yeah, it's always through these kind of untold stories. Iraq is a highly documented place, and you see that through the archive. There's a lot of kind of mostly colonial archives that exist and represent that place. But what slips through the cracks is the part that I'm really kind of interested in. So archive and media almost sit in that similar zone, that they have a blind spot somehow. And it's kind of really kind of trying to point to a part of the story that is not represented, but a part of the story that I think is kind of representative of my personal experience, but also my family's experience. That yes, it might not be something that is kind of directly related to their experience, but it kind of represents a more kind of a collective condition that they fall under, that I'd really like to kind of capture and make meaning of.
So that's interesting as well. Yeah, I think Rand was kind of shooting a question your way there as well, Baz, with regards to, I suppose, that kind of this kind of shared history, but living kind of outside of Iraq, and then having, I suppose, being in a space with regards to trying to understand the creed of ownership over this narrative that you're very much part of, but also, I suppose, there's a creed of separateness almost.
I think that's probably the like that feeling that you've expressed around I relate to that 100%, and I think that's one of the nature of diaspora as well too, is a feeling of maybe wanting to belong, but then when you're trying to do something that's related to a culture that you have a connection to and you feel a belonging to, but you have a disconnect from through being in the diaspora, there is always this question of can I do this authentically? Am I an imposter here? How will people view this? And that's a question that kind of I carry around with me almost on a daily basis, and certainly when I'm working on this project and creating an archive comes with its own baggage. There's always the question around ownership and representation, and who's creating the archive, why are they creating it, and so those are questions that I have been asking myself throughout this process, about what type of an archive it is, and even the word archive is so loaded that I've come to the point where I'm wanting to perhaps change it or remove it altogether, because I feel like it's too loaded, and especially related to Iraq. And that's, I guess that's the process of engaging with people, and the archive comes with all these other impressions. So yeah, I do relate to that feeling quite a bit, and this, to build any kind of a collective identity, it begins with a personal individual story. And it's the aggregation of those individual stories that contribute to the collective. And again, you can't put it better than that. This idea of Iraq being viewed from a distance and from above, when it's actually an aggregation of so many experiences, and so many disparate experiences and diverse experiences. And it's an interesting thing. And like growing up in Ireland, there's a conversation all the time about the Irish diaspora, and it's something that the Irish are very proud of, that we have this huge diaspora across the globe. That there's more Irish outside of Ireland than there is in Ireland, and then, so, I think growing up in that environment and with this discussion of Irish diaspora obviously raised questions to me about, the Irish left this country for many different reasons over the years, and some have been exiled from it, but they can probably return if they want to. They're very welcome to return. But I think that the experience of Iraqi diaspora is quite different, and so I think that for me, that's where that was also maybe a catalyst for this project as well too, is to kind of tap into that notion of belonging, and how can you belong, and how can you feel that you are, to go back to the original kind of question, how can you feel okay with working on this kind of material, and I suppose I'm constantly reflecting on why I'm doing it, and where I'm coming from with it, and there's definitely predominantly a level of personal that motivates it, and personal identity, but also this from now interacting with other artists and other members of the diaspora who are working in similar vein, and no more so than Rand, is realizing that there are kindred spirits out there who are also trying to achieve similar goals through their work, and just through different mediums and through different ways.
I think there is a massive value in the creed of work that you're doing, especially I think when we kind of consider notions around identity today. I'd just like to say thank you both so much for joining us here at the Museum of Everyone, and for being so open and wonderful and articulate about your projects.
Thanks, Brendan.
Thank you for having us.